Well, thank you, Tom. I don't know who the snake is, but I do wish Liverpool's defence would learn to take the snake by the tail at the moment, but we won't go into that. It's actually based on the scriptures, and perhaps the place to begin in this session is to actually just take a look at Exodus chapter 4, because of course those two chapters of Exodus, particularly 3 and 4, really present to us the picture of Moses as he is facing his call to leadership, and it's from that this metaphor comes. So let me just read those couple of verses from the beginning of Exodus chapter 4, and of course it begins in chapter 3 where Moses has seen the burning bush, he's heard the voice of God, and he is commissioned to go to Egypt to bring the people to the promised land. And they're in the point where Moses is saying, yes, but, should we say. Moses, the conversation continues in verse 1. Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? And then the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? And a staff, he replied. And the Lord said, throw it on the ground. And Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. So therein lies the cryptic title for this particular session. And I wanted to take a moment to look at this question that God asks Moses in Exodus chapter 4. What is it that you have in your hand? And I guess that we could say that what we've been trying to look at in the opening session today could be summarized by that simple question. What is it you've got in your hand? What is it I've got on my hands as I look to the future and I look to the past? And I just want us to pause for a minute and to think about what that answer that Moses gives to God represents. Moses, of course, has a staff in his hand. And the first thing that we might want to say is that what that staff represents is it's a sign of the moment. If we read the beginning of chapter 3, we're told that Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro in the desert, and the staff was a tool of the trade. Moses used to be a prince in Egypt. Moses had fled. Moses had been a nomad, but he had found family. He'd found a place in the house of Jethro. And from what we can gather, he was reasonably good at being a herdsman and taking care of the family flock. And so that staff, of course, is the typical thing you would expect a desert herdsman to hold. And to some degree, that's part of what we've got in our hands at the moment. We can only inhabit the moment. And I think particularly one of the things that we're going to need to face as we look to the future is we may need to, for a while yet, be those who simply can deal with what's in front of us rather than necessarily assume that we've got some great plan that we can follow. And so but the staff also, it represents a tool of the trade. And again, we just might want to pause there and recognize that although Moses has spent this time in the wilderness, in many respects, this was an equipping. It wasn't just a matter of him recovering from the fallout that he'd had in Egypt. It wasn't just a matter of him escaping. But of course, he got to know the wilderness. He got to know how to find his way around the wilderness. He knew the wilderness so well that even when he saw a bush that looked out of place or didn't seem to be in season or whatever else we understand to mean by this sense of he turned aside to see what it was, he knew the landscape, he knew where he was, and he was good at what he did. And of course, this was going to become invaluable to him as he made his way, or as he took on the mantle of leadership. He was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. And we recognize, therefore, that this represents not simply his own skill set, not simply the time that he finds himself in, but he is now part of a new community, a community that will not for the first time be those upon whom he relies as he goes into his future calling. You may remember there's a time, if you look later on in the book of Exodus, when Moses is trying to struggle just with the sheer administration of this community of people that God has placed him as a leader, and it's Jethro is the one that advises him and begins to say to him, look, you know, you need to reorganize, you need to find judges. So again, the people around him were an important part of who he was and what that staff represented. And then, of course, he's got a massive history. And I think one of the things I find interesting, and this is where I find this story of Moses particularly relevant to our current situation, is Moses, of course, has almost 3 life stories by this point. You first of all got the story of the boy who grows up in the palace, the boy who knew he belonged to this Hebrew community, this boy who identified with the slave people, and yet at the same time had a place in the royal court, was someone of influence. And as I think about that and think about some of the stuff that we were talking about today, I think, you know, sometimes we can learn so much if we just reflect on the human aspect of the stories of our scriptures. And, you know, just to put yourself in Moses' shoes for a moment as he's a young man, and how many of the angry young men of his Hebrew race would have rejected him because he was seen as someone of privilege, how many would have laden him with expectation because, well, you've got influence, you've got the ear of Pharaoh, why can't you do something about our situation? And so I think you've got a life phase in Moses where he must have lived with this incredible paradox and this tension of identity. And then, of course, you've got this moment when he loses it, and he sees an overseer beating one of the slaves, and he just sees red, and he ends up killing the overseer. And so he runs for his life. He becomes a refugee. He becomes a fugitive. And so you've got a history of failure. But of course, what is interesting is that if you just stop and look at his heart story, what was it that drove him to want to kill that overseer? It was his desire to see his people set free. And God meets him in the desert after this 3rd phase of his life, when perhaps he got used to it. Perhaps he got used to the wilderness. Perhaps it had become a comfortable place for him. And God says, no, actually, that original calling, that anger that was so displaced when you killed that overseer, I am now going to use for good. And I am now going to use as the means of bringing my people to the place of liberation. And I just want to invite you for a moment to sort of stand in Moses' shoes, which of course you can't do because he'd taken his shoes off. But stand there for a moment with that staff in your hand and say, well, what is my answer to that question? What is it that I've got in my hand? What is it that's about where I am right now? What are the skills that I bring? What are the networks of support that perhaps I need to re-recognize as being there for me? And actually, what is the history that perhaps is a difficult history to acknowledge, that perhaps is not an easy reality for me to encounter, but actually it's part of who I am. And in Moses' case, it was part of what God could use. And so I just wanted to pause for a moment, really, and maybe just take a minute as I switch over the slides to just, what is your answer to that question in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 2? What are you bringing in your hand as we begin to try and find ourselves again in this new world? And then God says to Moses in verse 3, throw it on the ground. Put the staff on the ground. And of course, the staff, as we know from the story, becomes a snake. And this really spoke to me when I first came across this, because I made a reference this morning to almost that sense of feeling terrified as we look to the future, and we see the mounting expectations, certainly for many that I've spoken to, that we sense may well be around as we look to the future. And the point that I want us to grasp here is that the moment Moses threw the snake on the ground, threw the staff on the ground, it suddenly became a whole lot more dangerous, or at least it looked a lot more dangerous. And as I reflected on that, I thought, you know, in many respects, that's kind of how I feel. And it's interesting, just in preparing just a few moments ago, talking about this, once you put it down, many of us, we will have put things down. We will have put responsibilities down. We'll have put routines down, where perhaps journeys that we've made, locations that we've been used to working in, we've put them down. We're not doing that anymore. We're not doing it that way anymore. And the thought of picking it up again, it suddenly looks a whole lot more daunting. It suddenly feels a lot more difficult now that it's on the ground. And of course, what Moses had to learn was that although at first sight, and it's interesting, we notice his first reaction, and we can't really be surprised by his first reaction, that Moses ran from it. Moses' first instinct was to say, I'm away, I'm out of here. I don't want this staff anymore. And I wonder, if we're honest with ourselves, whether there's a little bit of us that's just thinking, you know, I just want to run right now. I just want to get away from whatever is coming. But actually, that snake on the ground represented, again, three things. The first is, yeah, it suddenly became dangerous to pick up, but he did pick it up, and it became a staff again. And maybe for some of us, we simply need to hear God saying to us right now, it will be okay when you pick it up again. It may feel dangerous. And yes, we need to be prepared, and we need to think, and we need to root ourselves so that we're ready. But actually, it will be okay. Just pick it up. The second thing, of course, is that God says, well, actually, you're going to use this staff, and this staff is going to do this again. But this time it's going to be in the court of Pharaoh. And it's going to be as part of convincing Pharaoh that you are the person that you say you are. And of course, this staff really almost takes center stage in the book of Exodus. It's the staff with which Moses lifts and parts the waters of the Red Sea. It's the staff with which he strikes a rock and water comes from it. And again, that story of the water from the rock is an interesting story, because if you happen to look it up and read it, you notice that he hits the rocks twice. He becomes impatient with God. And so it still at times becomes the means by which he messes up. But it also has the potential to become something greater. And again, as we look to the future and begin to think about what we might be, there are a lot of narratives around that say, you know, this could be our hour. The church could come out of this a lot more healthy. There are others that are saying it may not be. But that staff had the potential to become something greater. And perhaps one of the questions that we simply need to ask ourselves at the moment is, what do I have the potential to become? What does this church have the potential to become? What does our nation, what does our community have the potential to become if it's truly placed in God's hands? And then the third thing, of course, is that God doesn't just say to Moses, pick it up. He says, pick it up by the tail. And this obviously is where the title for this session comes from, because anybody that knows anything about picking up snakes will tell you that you do not pick a snake up by its tail. You pick it up by just the back of its neck, because if you pick it up by its tail, it will come round and it will bite you, and it will just coil, and you've had it. The poison's there. You do not pick up a snake by its tail. And God is saying to Moses, I want you to trust me. I want you to do something that is going to be very counterintuitive. I want you to do something that at first sight doesn't feel like the natural thing to do. And again, perhaps there's something for us in that as we look to the future, as God says, you know, it's going to be very easy to just be driven by instinct. It's going to be very easy to just react to whatever the latest legislation arrives. But actually, there are times when, as my people, I call you to do that which is counterintuitive. There are times when I invite you to do that which isn't perhaps at first sight the most logical thing to do. And that kind of just speaks to me of the need to be a discerning people as we go forward, because we will be surrounded by knee-jerk reactions. We will be surrounded by those who will want to tell us what the obvious thing to do is. And it seems to me that we need to be a church saying, well, what is God inviting us to do? So I wanted to just use that little insight into the story of Moses as just a way of, again, helping us perhaps just engage a little bit more pastorally. But obviously, we can also think about, maybe draw on some of the knowledge and the expertise that is available to us as we look to the future. And so I've asked Jane, as the sort of second part of this particular presentation, to just offer us some thoughts around some of the work that she's done in the past with helping companies, very often helping organizations to cope with change and to cope with the unexpected. And I wanted to earth it in that story of Moses, but I think Jane can also help us think about this from the perspective of some of the expertise that's available to us. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and we're going to listen to what Jane has to say.
During the past year, many of us, in seeking to find ourselves, have discovered new footpaths and new places to explore within easy reach of our homes. Perhaps we've found ourselves in a place we've not been in before, particularly if we've chosen to simply explore rather than follow a prescribed route or a map. One of the downsides for me of simply exploring is that you can often miss the signposts indicating footpaths. Some footpaths follow the fence line, others head straight across the middle of a field. Some are well marked, others are not. Some have resulted in my being faced with trying to navigate through a mudslick, wondering if it will hold or if I'm likely to sink and get stuck. And the decision then is to turn back the way I've come, or to chance the mudslick and hope it holds, or possibly to navigate my way around on what appears to be solid ground. But often what looks like attractive, grassy and solid ground on either side of the mud is anything but that. Looks can be deceptive. That seemingly firm bit of earth can sometimes be a waterlogged bog, which looks seductively secure, but in actual fact sucks your boots in and causes more difficulties than navigating the mudslick. Water gathers and moves around underground in ways not obvious from above. What we see on the surface is not necessarily what's going on underneath. The landscape is complex and uncertain, rather like the situation we find ourselves in today, a year into the COVID pandemic. Our landscape is constantly changing. We may try to put in place a map, but that may not be accurate. There is uncertainty all around us, and much of what is happening is way outside of our control. We think we see solutions, but we are only able to see the surface, and underneath things look very different. Problems which we would navigate easily under other circumstances become more complex, less linear and with more connections. Our previous solutions do not necessarily work, and new solutions are not always obvious. Leadership research tells us that we need to adjust our leadership style depending on the landscape we find ourselves in. I've used the metaphor of a muddy field as a landscape of complexity and uncertainty, but a more relevant metaphor might be an ice field, because ice fields are constantly shifting. They're more akin to rivers than to land. Ice flows expose unexpected patches of freezing water. Ice can suddenly break away, causing deep crevasses. The landscape is in constant flux, unpredictable, uncertain, and complex. And this is the landscape that we as leaders of churches find ourselves in today. The landscape created by the worldwide pandemic. A landscape that is unpredictable, where we might attempt a roadmap, but which may become irrelevant as other things change. Where unexpected things happen and we're required to negotiate unknown terrain with little prior experience or aids to navigation. The research tells us that there are three main characteristics of this ice field landscape that we need to take into account if we are to successfully navigate our way through. When we've been operating in a simple, more predictable environment for some time, we may not be conscious of the overall purpose for what we do. It just may not be in our mind in our day-to-day lives. Habits and ways of operating become the goals in themselves. But in our icefield landscape, our usual ways of operating may not be possible. And without a framework to understand our purpose, we may not know what to do and which direction to move in. Although as churches we may believe we are all working towards the same goal, there is often simply an assumption of shared understanding. We might think we all know why we're there and what needs to be done, but in fact, everyone has their own very different perceptions. In the icefield landscape, these differences, if they remain uncovered, can cause conflict and division. Because the future is uncertain and the landscape unstable, problems and issues tend to be more complex than we might realise. Things can change in short timescales, and we can miss the interconnectedness of one problem with another. Problems and attempted solutions can interact with unforeseen consequences, both negative and positive. In this complex landscape, we need to consider our leadership style. As leaders, our intuition in this changing environment might be to try to simplify problems and issues in order to get clarity, to seek quick and easy solutions, in order to feel that we are in control and are making progress. We might feel that we need to be more directive in our leadership style because people need to see a strong leader who knows what they're talking about, who can lead from the front and who others can simply follow. But research suggests the opposite. The most successful leadership style in the icefield landscape is counterintuitive to many of us. It's picking the snake up by what we might feel is the wrong end, by its tail. The advice from the research on how we navigate this complex landscape is actually, I think, very Baptist. Because, firstly, it says we need to recognise our interdependence and connectedness to each other. We need to build on these connections and amplify the sense of being in this situation together. It says that we as leaders should let go of the need to have all the answers or to be seen to be the expert. When we encourage participation in exploring possibilities together, when we bring in different voices, then we create a climate of resourcefulness, resilience, and trust. The ownership of the problem space within the landscape then becomes shared. As leaders, the research suggests that we invest in creating opportunities for constructive dialogue, drawing in people with different perspectives on the nature of the problem, and encouraging people to explore creative possibilities. Our focus initially in this dialogue should be on the why and the what for, not necessarily the how. We need to slow down, allowing time for dialogue, letting go of a desire for quick action, and collectively to focus our energies on the things that inspire us, or in our terms, that God inspires in us. And navigating this complex, chaotic and uncertain landscape is best done by trying things and learning from experience. Allowing experimentation without fear of failure and without repercussions is helpful when problems are complex and solutions not obvious. Our job as leaders is to create the culture within our churches for this to happen. Over the last 12 months, many of us have been doing some of this already. We have tried alternative ways of worshipping and connecting. We've sought creative solutions to continuing some of the activities that we used to do in person or in the church building. And through our experimentation, we have learned what can work and what doesn't. And we may have found surprising new things about ourselves and others as we've done this. So as we begin to think about how we do church in the coming months, I offer these ideas based on the research to help us lead in this landscape in which we find ourselves. Hold the space. Begin by seeking a shared understanding of today's reality, how things are for people. Allow the space for people to express the good, the bad, the losses, and the gains. Seek shared understanding. Invite both leaders and congregation into a dialogue together. Find ways to clarify and gain a shared understanding of the church's purpose. Is it simply to open up the church again as it was before? Or is there something around making disciples that we need to focus on? Or is it to join in what God is already doing in our communities? Or is it something else? Create a learning environment. Design conversations that generate possibilities rather than close options down, linking what we do to our purpose. What is it that we can try, and how will that further our purpose? What connections can we make with that purpose that we have shared and agreed and understood? In all of this, it goes without saying that as leaders and congregations, we do all this in the context of prayerfully listening to what God has to say to us at this time. Let us, as churches, find ourselves once again in whatever landscape we may find ourselves having to navigate in now and in the future.
Thanks, Jane. And hopefully, that was really, really helpful as a way of kind of bringing to earth some of what we've talked about. And if I just bring you back to the slide that we looked at earlier on, it strikes me that a lot of what Jane is talking about is what we're calling the recovery and discovery stage here. And again, I think it's important we don't try and put too tight a timetable on that at the moment, so much as to say if we're going to reach new normal or new different or whatever it may be, perhaps we need to make sure that we build the time in to do that. So we want to give you a chance to think about how you might do that, and I'm going to hand back to Tom at this point.